In 1971, 6 out of every 10 Americans belonged to the middle class. That wasn't a talking point, that was the actual economic majority of the country. Today, that number has fallen to just over 5 out of 10, and barely. The middle class isn't just shrinking, it's on the edge of no longer being the majority experience in America at all. And the question that actually matters isn't just whether this is happening, it's why, and whether it means what most people assume it means. I am David from Dollar Horizon, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forces that quietly reshape how people live, decades before anyone notices the shift happened. If you've ever felt like the version of stability your parents had should be achievable for you too, and it just isn't lining up the way it did for them, this video is going to explain exactly why. Stick around and hit subscribe if you want more of this.
Let's start with the number everyone quotes, because it's worth understanding precisely. In 1971, 61% of American adults lived in middle-income households. By 2023, that number had dropped to 51%. That's a 10 percentage point decline over 50 years. To put that in perspective, that's tens of millions of people who, under the exact same economic classification, would have been considered middle class 2 generations ago and are not today. Now here's where the story gets genuinely more interesting than the headline suggests, because there are 2 very different explanations for that number, and both are partially true at the same time. The first explanation, the one most people assume, is that families are falling behind. Wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living, and people who would have comfortably been middle class in 1971 have been pushed downward into the lower income tier. And there's real evidence supporting this. Since 1971, the share of Americans in the lower income tier actually grew too, from 27% up to 30%. That's not a small number. That's millions of additional people who fell out of the middle, not up, but down. But here's the second explanation, and it complicates the story in a way that most viral content about this topic completely ignores. During that same 50-year period, the share of Americans in the upper income tier nearly doubled, from 11% up to 19%. Some economists argue that the shrinking middle class isn't really a story of decline at all. It's a story of a booming upper middle class, more families earning enough to graduate out of the middle bracket entirely, in a good way. Researchers at the American Enterprise Institute have made exactly this argument, that decrying a shrinking middle class is really just a complicated way of saying more families have moved up, not down. So which story is true? Honestly, both are, simultaneously. And understanding that tension is the entire key to understanding what's actually happening to the middle class in America. The middle isn't shrinking because everyone is falling. It's shrinking because the country is polarizing in both directions at once. More people at the top, more people at the bottom, and fewer people occupying the stable middle ground that used to define the American experience for the majority. But even if some families are moving up, that doesn't mean the middle-class squeeze isn't real for millions of others. And this is where the numbers get genuinely brutal. Let's talk about housing, because this is the single biggest structural shift behind why middle-class life feels so much harder to achieve today than it did for previous generations. The median price of a single-family home in America has more than doubled since 2012, climbing from around $164,000 to over $357,000. That's not adjusted for some unusual market spike. That's the baseline reality of what a typical home costs now compared to just over a decade ago. Wages during that same period grew nowhere near that pace, which means the exact same job, the exact same income trajectory that would have comfortably supported a home purchase for a middle-class family in 2012 simply does not stretch far enough today. Here's a number that captures this even more precisely. The cost of raising a child in America grew by 150% between 2000 and 2025. Wages over that same period grew by only 112%. That's nearly a 40 percentage point gap between how much it costs to raise a family and how much the average paycheck actually grew to cover it. This is the mathematical core of the middle-class squeeze. It's not that people are working less hard or making worse decisions than their parents did. It's that the fundamental costs of living a middle-class life, housing, childcare, healthcare, have grown dramatically faster than the income meant to pay for them. Healthcare and student debt add even more pressure on top of that. Employer healthcare premiums climb nearly every year, quietly eating into paychecks before workers ever see the increase. Student debt, which barely existed as a mass phenomenon 50 years ago, now sits as a monthly obligation for tens of millions of people who were told a college degree was the reliable path into the middle class, and in many cases found themselves paying for that path for decades afterward.
Now here's something that makes this story even more complicated, and it's rarely discussed in most breakdowns of this topic. Where you live has become almost as important as how much you earn. The middle class hasn't shrunk evenly across the entire country. It has collapsed most severely in expensive coastal cities and major metro areas, places where housing costs have detached almost completely from local wages. Meanwhile, many parts of the Midwest and rural America have remained comparatively affordable, where a similar income can still support a genuinely stable middle-class life. This means two people earning the exact same salary can have completely different economic realities depending entirely on their zip code. The national statistic hides an enormous amount of local variation that matters enormously to individual families trying to figure out whether they're actually falling behind or not. So what does all of this actually mean if you're trying to build a stable financial life in America right now, regardless of which side of this debate turns out to be more true? Here's the practical reality. The traditional middle-class formula, get a steady job, buy a house, raise a family, retire comfortably, was built for an economic environment where wages and major life costs grew at roughly the same pace. That environment doesn't exist anymore. Housing, childcare, and healthcare have detached from wage growth in a way that makes the old formula mathematically harder to execute than it used to be, even for people doing everything right. This doesn't mean the goal is impossible. It means the path there requires more intentionality than it used to. Geographic flexibility matters more than it did 50 years ago, because the same income can mean middle-class comfort in one city and financial strain in another. Avoiding lifestyle creep matters more, because the margin for error has genuinely shrunk. And building multiple income streams, rather than relying entirely on a single paycheck to absorb costs that are rising faster than wages, has gone from being a nice-to-have strategy to something closer to a financial necessity for a lot of families trying to stay stable. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. The version of middle-class life that existed in 1971 required less financial sophistication to achieve because the system itself was more forgiving. Today's version requires more planning, more flexibility, and more awareness of exactly where your money's going, not because people have gotten worse with money, but because the structural math underneath middle-class life has genuinely shifted. Whether you believe the middle class is shrinking because families are falling behind or shrinking because more families are moving up, the practical advice for staying financially stable in this environment is exactly the same either way. Understand your actual numbers. Keep your fixed costs, especially housing, from consuming too much of your income. Build income streams that don't depend on a single employer. And recognize that the formula that worked for your parents' generation may need real adjustment to work for yours, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the economic ground itself has shifted beneath everyone's feet. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening beneath the headlines, subscribe, because next we're breaking down exactly how to build financial stability in a country where the old rules don't fully apply anymore.